Privyet, moi druzy. Welcome, my friends. It's great to have you back again. Today, I'm going to go through a number of events that it's a continuation of what's been going on for the last few days, but it'll hopefully give you a great deal of insight into what's going on. The theme I want to talk about is pretty simple. Are the Russians lying or are they just incompetent? We're going to talk about the Dnipro missile attack. We're going to talk about the Russian Ministry of Defense versus Wagner. The saga is continuing. We'll talk about Soledar and Bakhmut and give you an update there. We'll talk about why Germany isn't leading when it comes to tanks for Ukraine. We'll talk about perceptions of Russia and Ukraine in various countries around the world. And then we'll conclude with some fun with Russian state media. Okay, so the first article is just a number of those impacted by the Dnipro missile strike has gone up a little bit. 39 people so far have been rescued, 40 have died, 79 were injured, including 16 children. Zelinski talked about this in his daily address. The debris of the house destroyed by the Russian missile is still being dismantled in Dnipro. I thank everyone who is carrying out this rescue operation. But then he goes on and says the strike at Dnipro, as well as other similar strikes, falls in particular under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And that's very true if they're intending to do it. I'm questioning whether they're competent enough to actually do that. So here's what I mean. Here's RT yesterday. Ukraine to blame for missile hitting Dnipro regional building. The Russian armed forces don't target residential buildings or social infrastructure facilities. The attacks are only aimed at military targets, said Peskov. Now, Peskov lies regularly, so I kind of brushed it aside. But I started rethinking this. They remember RT blamed a senior Ukrainian advisor, President Zelinski's, that said the explosion at the residential building, the missile was shot down and apparently fell and exploded while falling, which didn't really hold water. The Ukrainian military also contradicted that presidential aide's account. Okay, so they said, we don't hit these buildings, and then they tried to pin it on what this presidential aide said, but I think it's something more than just outright lying. And here, follow me. So this is the intelligence update by the British today, and they said this: as 4 Kitchen large anti-ship missiles launched from a Tu-22M3 backfire medium bomber highly likely struck a block of flats in the Dnipro city, which resulted in the death of at least 40 people. So this was an anti-ship missile. Now, Russia's falsely implied a Ukrainian air defense missile was responsible. Kitchen is notoriously inaccurate when used against ground targets. Okay, well, that's interesting to know. Similar weapons have been responsible for other incidents of civilian mass casualties, including the Kremachuk shopping center strike of 27 June 2022. So that's revising some of the way that we're thinking about this. Were these intentional terrorist incidents, or are they just really bad and incompetent when they fire their missiles? While some missiles, such as Kitchen, are unsuitable for precision strike, evidence from the Ukraine war suggests the dysfunction of Russia's long-range strike capability is more profound. So, are they just lying, or are they incompetent? Either way, it's a bad story, but it's still an interesting story to try to figure out which is which. Okay, let's talk about this. This is from Eurasian Times, and it's the same kind of thing. Ukraine's Air Force Command claimed on Facebook on January 15th that the Kh-22 missiles Russia used in a recent attack on the Ukrainian city of Dnipro on January 14th could not be shot down by the nation's air defense. The Kh-22 is an anti-ship missile in the Russian inventory that has over time earned the moniker of an aircraft carrier killer. That's what they hit this building with, which is pretty amazing, the amount of damage that this had. Even though Ukraine's identification system is advanced enough to recognize the approaching missiles as Kh-22, they have yet to shoot one down successfully. So that kind of takes care of that false story right away. The missiles have proved incredibly imprecise, especially in densely populated areas. Kh-22 missiles frequently hit civilian targets while missing their objectives by several hundred meters. That's pretty bad. I mean, that's more of the incompetent than the lying camp. Doesn't mean they can't lie as well, but It just shows incompetence. They've been used extensively in Ukraine due to decreasing stocks of more precise modern long-range weapons in the Russian inventory. However, due to a lack of precision, they cause large-scale human casualties, as has been showcased on several occasions. More to the point, they don't care. They're okay with the large-scale casualties. And then they lie about, well, we're not targeting civilians, but they're not doing anything to minimize this either. Think about how the United States goes out of its way to not hit civilian casualties while they're, like, for example, in Afghanistan. They just a few months back struck one of the highest ranking ISIS leaders that they eluded for years, right? They got the guy with a strike that went through his window, or through, like, he was out on his deck, and it only hit that strike from, I don't know how far away, but it only hit that. There were no collateral damage around. That apartment looked like it's seen better days, but he was hit, not everyone around. The Russians don't seem to care about that sort of thing. Okay. Here's the ISW. The Kremlin continues to publicly challenge Wagner Group financier Prigozhin's claim that Wagner Group forces were solely responsible for capturing Soledar. Again, the military and Wagner are at odds. Putin attributed the success on the front lines to the Russian Ministry of Defense and General Staff plans. Well, of course, Prigozhin's trying to make his name. He's trying to make his name on the dead bodies of those that were killed. By the way, let's talk about that. How many people were killed in trying to seize Bakhmut, and then trying to seize Soledar? So they couldn't take Bakhmut, so they tried to seize Soledar. Soledar, I talked about yesterday, is about 5 square miles, but its population is only 10,000. According to British estimates, they lost 15,000 either killed or wounded trying to take a city of 10,000. That estimate by the Ukrainians is almost 20,000 killed. So by either measure, this was like taking this tiny little piece of real estate cost them tremendously. Okay, let me get back to the story. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov probably indirectly accused Prigozhin. Peskov attempted to dispel reports of an ongoing conflict between Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense, stating that these reports are product of information manipulations. But Peskov, however, added that while most such manipulations come from Russia's enemies, the Kremlin also has friends who also behave in a similar way. That's a backhanded way of swiping at Prigozhin. So Peskov's statement may have been targeting him. Prigozhin is continuing his efforts to undermine faith in the Russian Ministry of Defense at the same time. So I think this is great that they're fighting with each other, because while they're fighting each other, they're not fighting their enemies in Ukraine effectively. So I think that's wonderful. Okay, Igor Girkin, a former Russian officer and prominent nationalist voice, claimed on January 16th that the Kremlin hopes to place Medvedchuk at the head of an alternative Ukrainian government. Now, who is this guy? See, if you remember, they traded him for 215 prisoners. He's a Ukrainian oligarch who was captured, and the Russians traded back for him for 215 prisoners back in September, including Azov battalion folks, if I recall correctly. So, like, he's a big deal. But if they're trying to, make him the head of a new government, wow, how about that? The appointment of the Russian chief of the General Staff, Army General Valery Gerasimov, and theater commander of Russian forces in Ukraine notably did not spark a significant wave of criticism within the Russian nationalist millblogger discourse. So millbloggers are these private individuals who are blogging about the war, and very often they've been taking the Ministry of Defense in Russia to task, which is really fascinating, considering how you can be fined or go to jail for even calling this a special military operation a war, because that's bad. Millbloggers largely claim Gerasimov's appointment signifies that the Russian Ministry of Defense is retaking responsibility for the war. I don't like the sound of that, but that may very well be correct. Okay, while I'm at it, I stumbled across this passage in this book. I was reading this morning, Leadership and Training for the Fight. It's about how military principles apply to leadership. And there was this one line in there that really grabbed my attention. It said, like, you need to know from your leader, how many people is he willing to kill to bring you back home safely? And I thought, wow, what a contrast. Like, that's the way that we think in the American context, right? As opposed to what's Prigozhin doing? He's got people on a 6-month contract. If you survive over the 6 months, you'll get your freedom. He's told them that if you try to surrender or retreat, we'll kill you. And, if you make it, great. If you don't make it, Okay, that's fine. We've gotten rid of some of the jail population. I mean, that's the way he's calculating it. So it's no wonder that they don't really have a high esprit de corps. They want to survive, but they're not really fighting like with the same kind of enthusiasm as their Ukrainian counterparts. Now, in Soledar, the Ukrainians are still fighting. Somebody in the comments actually said it was kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. I don't know that that's the case, but they haven't left the region. They're still shooting, and Soledar was, decimated. So it's basically ruins. There's not a lot of places to hide. Ukraine has not conceded defeat in Soledar, with President Volodymyr Zelinski saying on Sunday evening that the battle for Soledar, battle for Bakhmut, and the whole Donetsk region for Luhansk region continues without any respite, without any stop. So they're still going on for it. And I don't know that Ukraine's going to just go, oh, well, you took the land, I guess we'll just leave. They're not thinking that way. Okay, here's some more about this in Radio Free Europe. Ukrainian forces in the east sustained incessant Russian attacks over the past 24 hours, and as Kyiv again appealed for faster deliveries of weapons. The Russians launched more than 70 attacks the previous day, shelling 15 settlements near the disputed city of Bakhmut, including the strategic town of Soledar, which has been all but razed to the ground by Russian shelling. So they're still at it. They're still fighting. Now, the first paragraph is what I'm going to go into next, and that is that they need these weapons. So what's going on? Why aren't they getting the weapons that they need? Well, pressure mounts on Germany. This is Al Jazeera. Pressure mounts on Germany as Ukraine urges faster arms supplies. Western and Ukrainian officials are piling pressure on Germany to approve the transfer of heavy battle tanks. Ben Wallace from the UK is saying that the move could unlock support from other nations. Remember, Poland said, here's 14. UK said, here's another 14. Germany, step up. You can do it. Now, I've gotten a lot of interesting comments because we've been talking about that over the last few days. They would ask me things like, why aren't you talking about the German defense minister stepping down? Because I don't know enough to be able to intelligently analyze that and provide facts. And I will only talk about what I can intelligently talk about. I talked the other day about how the Germans are playing the long game. And part of that, at least part of that, and I think much of that is based on business ties to Russia. They're looking down the road and like, when this thing's over, we're going to reconnect with Russia. But there's more to it, and I think some people have rightly pointed out there's more to it. Some people have ties to Russia because of East Germany or political inclinations or whatever else. There are other pieces of the puzzle. That's not the only thing, but that's part of what's stopping them. They also have the World War II hangover, and so they've gotten into a very non-warring kind of mentality for a couple of generations, and that was by design. And I understand that. That makes a lot of sense to me. So did Japan as well, shortly after World War II. So I get that, but they're holding up the works. So some people have said, well, how can you ask them to give tanks, and what would that look like? Okay, so lead with humanitarian stuff. Be the humanitarian leader of Europe, if that's the way that you want to do it. But by all means, look at what's happening to Ukraine. By an aggressor state, intervene and help, however you define that help. Ukraine has so far primarily relied on Soviet-era T-72 tank variants. The Western tanks are much stronger and able to give more of a pounding. There's a debate in Germany at the moment about whether a tank is an offensive or defensive weapon. So that's where they're stuck. They don't want to be seen as giving anything offensive, but they kind of need to. They need to give something that will allow them to take the fight to their enemy on their land. Well, that depends on what you're using it for. If you're using it to defend your country, I would wager it's a defensive weapon. So that's the way that they're kind of rationalizing. But they got down to this last couple of paragraphs. Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck said on Thursday, Berlin should not stand in the way of countries that want to send Leopard tanks to Ukraine from their own stocks. It was not right that Germany should hinder, quote, countries that had made decisions to support Ukraine, he was reported as saying. And I think that's a fair thing. So Germany, just because they're Germany, are going to have an outside impact on what the EU does. And that's true with most things. Germany and France are fairly large compared to some of the other countries. And so because that's the case, like, you can't not lead. Okay, you're already a leader, so we need you to step up and step up however you want. If you wanted to say, like, we're going to be the humanitarian leader of everything related to this war and just take care of people, that would be fine if that was your role and you were stepping into it. But okay, I've spent enough time on that. Let's shift our gears and talk about Politico. Politico had this really interesting article about how the invasion of Ukraine slammed Russia's global reputation. And across Europe, like the view that people have now, as opposed to in February of 2022, when the invasion launched, before the invasion, it's dramatically differently. Adults in the UK have the most unfavorable view of Russia, negative 79% percentage points, 100 either way, plus 100 or down 100, negative 79. So it's not pretty from the UK. Followed by people in Japan, negative 75. I didn't know Japan was that negative in their view of this. These feelings are shared by EU countries like Germany, negative 68, France, negative 68, Italy, negative 69, Spain, negative 69. US public opinion is only negative 62, right? So that's pretty severe. But of course, in Europe, you're a lot closer to what's actually happening. So that does kind of make sense. The poll also shows that support for Ukraine is not unanimous. Asian countries, including China, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, retain a net negative view of Ukraine, not of Russia. I mean, that's amazing. So the propaganda from RT is being sent out, and it's actually working. That's what that tells me. EU member countries such as France and Germany, which play a key role in sanctioning Russia and providing military support to Ukraine, is not favorable to Kyiv, although Russia is much more unpopular. So in France and Germany, they don't like Kyiv necessarily, but Russia's even more unpopular is what it's saying. So that's some interesting perspective. Okay, now let's have some fun with Russian state media. First article, EU leaves backdoor open for sanctioned Russian oil, says Bloomberg. And so this is carried in RT, talking about what Bloomberg said was open. India may substantially boost exports of diesel fuel to the EU, refined Russian oil targeted by Western sanctions. So what's going to happen is oil flows from Russia to India, and India is lapping it up. I mean, they're scooping it up. Forget what's going on with Ukraine or the morality of that. They can get cheap oil, and they're all in. Right? The scheme wouldn't breach the EU's regulations, but it highlights the inefficiency of the inherent sanctions policy. So what's happening is they get the crude oil from Russia, then they convert it into diesel, and then they would be selling it back to the EU. So what actually material has changed? Until recently, Russia was the biggest external supplier of diesel to EU countries, but if they're essentially selling it in a different form, okay. At the beginning of 2022, Russia's share of India's oil imports amounted to just 0.2%. By the end of last year, it had grown by nearly 1 million barrels a day, reaching more than 20% of the country's oil import basket. So yeah, India's lapping it up. Now, I wanted to verify that because it is an RT. And yes, I am finding that this is largely true. Here's the business standard. Huge sanctions are looming for fuel that powers the world. We're talking about diesel. Unprecedented chunk of global diesel market. The workhorse of the global economy is just weeks away from being subject to aggressive sanctions. The G7 is well aware of this, and I think they're going to plug that hole. Okay, Russian defense minister visits the frontline headquarters. Sure he does. Okay, Russian defense minister Sergei Shoigu has inspected the headquarters of the East grouping of forces taking part in the country's military operation in Ukraine, the defense ministry said on Tuesday. Now, I'm going to read this quote in a little bit, but they didn't say exactly where he was, just as he was visiting. Where's he visiting? The front line. Well, I looked it up in the Moscow Times as well. What did the Moscow Times have to say? And they said, a Russian defense minister visits troops fighting in Ukraine. They did not specifically say the location of the meeting. The RT called it the front lines. And then they also mentioned this. Shoigu also inspected the so-called Special Military Operation Zone twice in December. Investigative journalists at the time geolocated the command post visited by Shoigu on December 18th as a village in annexed Crimea, more than 80 kilometers from the front lines. So is he visiting the front lines? Not like Zelinski visited the front lines. There's a loose interpretation of what front lines means. Now, while he was there, he also said this. He told his troops, "You are serving with dignity, protecting our motherland, helping those who need help, doing everything to bring closer the day called the Victory Day. I'm sure we will do everything for this day to come." What a bunch of crap. I mean, you're actually causing the harm. You are the ones that are the aggressors, that are inflicting pain and misery on your innocent neighbors, and Yeah, okay. I'm not going to spend any more time on that. Okay, next. Todd Zelinski aide resigns amid apartment block blast uproar. So this is the guy that said that, well, it looks like we hit the missile and then it fell and exploded. He was a Zelinski aide, presidential aide, previously described his remark as a serious mistake made during a live broadcast. The level of hate directed at me is incomparable with the consequences of the on-air mistake, Arestroff said. And so, yeah, you got to get it right. I mean, there really is, I expect the backlash, right? So I take this very seriously, and I'm just a little YouTuber here, and I'm taking this incredibly seriously. I don't talk about what I can't prove and show you that I'm proving it with the highlights and the actual articles. And if something's wrong, I'll tell you something went wrong. But yeah, you just have to have a high standard of truth. Okay, then it gets down to the bottom of the article and they say this: Arestroff may be launching a career as a politician with his resignation. Russian political expert Marat Bashirov suggested on his Telegram feed, reacting to the news. Zelinski's office may find it, quote, difficult to shut him up, he suggested. Okay, well, now this is the kind of speculation that I try not to do, but this is RT's bread and butter because it's propaganda. Okay, Russia reaps bumper grain harvest. According to the latest data, they're up 26.7% increase year over year against 2021. So two things about that. One, that seems fairly improbable. And just because RT lies, I'm going to take it with a grain of salt that you can add an extra quarter of your actual ability during the war. And that sounds a little fishy, but I can't prove otherwise. I'm just saying that seems improbable. But it's also a whole lot easier to do this when nobody's firing missiles at you. So the comparison would be made in the minds of the readers to, well, what's going on in Ukraine? Well, they're getting missiles shot at them, and so it's going to be down. But I would want to know more about this before I would say anything particularly about whether that is true or not true. So folks, if you appreciated what we talked about here, like, subscribe, ring the bell. Thank you for your time. If you wish to support my channel, you can buy me a coffee, and thank you to those of you who did. I really appreciate it. And one last thing, Dyaku Shokyu Boliviadze za Ukrainiu. Thank you for cheering for or supporting Ukraine.